what Bishop Hay asks in this section is, are we obliged to know the commandments? The obvious answer is yes, we are most undoubtedly obliged to obey the commandments. All right, it says, the obligation which all lie under in keeping the commandments obliges all to know them. For how can they obey what they do not know? Right? Very, very, very simple. If God expects us to obey his commandments, he expects us to know his commandments. So this is what he says. So he says, we may observe 3 different degrees in perfection in knowing the commandments. There's 3 different ways in which we can grow in our knowledge of the commands, or maybe even stages in which we know the commands. He says the first one is to know the words of the commandments by heart. This is the first and lowest degree of knowledge of them. That is necessary, but will be to little purpose if we rest in it only and go no further. So it's almost like, almost kind of very elementary. We can memorize the commandments, we know them by heart. But if you only stay there, then it will be of no benefit. He said it'll be of no benefit to you towards salvation. And of course, we've got to obey him. Not just simply know them, not just simply know the words of the page, not just simply quote the scriptures, right? Not just simply quote the scriptures, but obey the scriptures. So this is why the whole concept of faith alone is so contrary to the scriptures and to what God and to the character and what God expects of us. Because if it's simply just believing the truths that God has revealed, what good is it simply to believe the truths that God has revealed and not obey the truths which God has revealed? Then you have no better faith than the demons who believe and tremble. In fact, probably the demons know the truths better than probably we do, but they have no obedience. They have no obedience. All right, so to be able just to quote the faith, to know the faith, is good. We need to know the faith, but you can't stop there. We need to know the commandments, but we can't stop there. That, believing the faith alone is of no value if you do not live the faith, right? What does St. Paul say? Faith, hope, and charity abide, but the greatest of these is charity. The actions of our faith, the actions of love, being in the state of grace. Being in that state of relationship with God, that state of grace, is the greatest, right? He said, I can have all faith so as to move mountains. I can have the greatest of faith, the most perfect and pure of faith, that I can move mountains. What our Lord say, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed and say to this mountain, go here and go there, it will do it. So you have a tiny grain of faith. So you have you have the faith of which Christ explains to have, but yet have not charity, then it's meaningless. So faith alone is meaningless if it's not accompanied, if it's not in connection with doing the will of God. And this, okay, anyway, so it's obvious here. So the same thing is, it'd be of no benefit to you if you know the commandments, if you know what God wills, but you don't do the will of God, right? The many will say to me on that day, will say, Lord, Lord, right, on this day. But do we not do these many great things in your name? He'll say, depart from me, who did wickedness. Many will say to me on this day, that will acknowledge me as Lord, profess me as Lord. But if you do not do the will of the Father, you cannot be in heaven. All right. So anyway, so the first, he says, is to just simply know him by heart. That's the start. But we don't stop there, right? We got to progress. We got to progress in our obligation to know the law. The number 2, he says, is to know the sense and meaning of the words, right? And the various duties and obligations contained in them. This is more than the former and most necessary, but still not sufficient. For though we should know our duty even so perfectly, this knowledge, if alone, instead of bring us to heaven, will rather increase our condemnation. So the first is just being able to quote it. The second is actually knowing what it means, actually understanding it. But of course, he says this is actually this if this left alone by itself would actually be worse for us, because this would bring greater condemnation, because we actually not only can actually memorize the words of what the commands are, but we actually understand what they mean. We know what we're expected to do, but then we don't do it. It's even worse for us. It's even greater condemnation. So that's step 2 in our obligation to the law, to obviously know what they are, to understand its proper meaning and how we are to fulfill it. And of course, in this we get from the church and its magisterium to understand what God desires and expects of us. We don't get it from the Protestants. We don't get it from those heretics, or any other. We get it from the church. The church teaches us the truths of the Scriptures. The church teaches us what God expects of us, and that's the Catholic Church I'm speaking of. Then he goes on to number 3. He says, to know the law of God in practice. This is where we should be, hopefully, eventually. In practice, to love it, to make it the rule of our conduct, and in everything to act according to its light. This is the true saving knowledge which we must all study to acquire. It says, be ye doers of the word, says the Holy Apostle James, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. For he that hath looked into the perfect law of liberty, and hath continued therein, not becoming a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, and this man shall be blessed in his deed. For St. Paul also says, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. And I'll just quote another from St. Paul. It says, circumcision is nothing, or non-circumcision, but what matters is obeying the commandments of God. Ave Maria.